The twin suns of Thraxis 9 rose like molten disks above the endless dunes, painting the horizon in colors that hurt the eyes. Heat shimmered across the desert, twisting the air into rippling illusions. Every few seconds, the ground cracked and hissed as moisture fled from the sand, leaving behind only the faint scent of burning minerals. The Galactic Academy's instructors watched from a hovering observation platform, their armor gleaming in the relentless light. Below, 50 cadets stood in formation, lined up on a plane so bright it seemed to be on fire. It was the beginning of the heat trial, the most infamous of all survival tests. The rules were merciless. Survive for 72 hours under open sun without external cooling, artificial shelters, or energy shields. No drones, no water synthesizers, no biotech interference. The only materials allowed were those naturally present on Thraxis 9, sand, rock, and air, so hot it could melt the edges of steel. Aaron Cross stood among them, the only human in the entire group. His standard-issue survival suit was thinner than the armor of the alien cadets beside him. It was designed for Earth-like climates, not for this infernal furnace. Sweat already beaded along his neck even before the trial officially began. Around him stood beings of every conceivable form: reptilian Vorn with heat-resistant scales, crystalline Vethra whose skin refracted sunlight into harmless rainbows, and the aquatic-descended Zelka with internal fluid coolants that could resist temperatures humans would consider lethal. He could feel their gazes flick toward him, half pity and half amusement. To them, he was the fragile species, the one known for soft skin, inefficient cooling, and an irrational dependence on water. The chief instructor, a towering insectoid named Zar Kun, spoke through the comm amplifiers, his voice dry and sharp like grinding stones. Cadets, this is the heat trial. The goal is not endurance alone, but adaptation. Survive until the third dusk, and your record will carry the mark of Thraxis. Fail, and your file will carry the burn of shame. You will receive no assistance. You may cooperate, but remember, cooperation does not guarantee survival. His mandibles clicked, and his compound eyes swept the line. Begin. A high-pitched tone rang out, signaling the start. The moment the sound faded, the cadets scattered across the dunes in various directions, each seeking some advantage before the suns reached their zenith. Some began digging immediately, seeking cooler layers beneath the surface. Others unfolded reflective membranes from their armor and set up temporary shades. The Vethra group walked confidently, their crystalline skins flashing with mirrored light, convinced that nothing on this world could harm them. Aaron, meanwhile, took a slow breath, feeling the sting of the dry air fill his lungs. His visor displayed the ambient temperature, 68 degrees Celsius, and rising. He adjusted his pack straps and started walking toward the nearest ridge. His boots sank into the powdery sand, which clung to his soles like molten glass dust. The landscape was featureless, an ocean of golden dunes under two suns that gave no mercy. Every step sent waves of heat up through his legs. He had read about Thraxis 9 during the briefing, a planet with a thin atmosphere and double solar exposure, used as a testing ground since most of its life forms had evolved extreme thermal resistance. Nothing green grew here. Only thorny mineral flora glimmered faintly in the heat like shards of obsidian. By the first hour, Aaron's suit was already struggling. The cooling layer inside was designed for a range far below this. He felt his heartbeat accelerate and his vision blur at the edges. But he didn't panic. He had grown up in the deserts of Earth. Not like this one, of course, but he knew the rhythm of survival under a merciless sky. His father had been a field geologist, and some of Aaron's earliest memories were of standing beside him in dry valleys, watching how shadows moved, how rocks cracked, how wind could carve even the hardest surface into shelter. He had always remembered one thing his father said: "The desert doesn't try to kill you. It simply doesn't care if you live." That idea had stuck with him. He paused at the top of a dune and turned to look behind him. The alien cadets had already begun to form groups. The Zelka were digging down, their elongated arms sweeping sand away with effortless speed. The Vorn were pressing their scaled bodies flat against the ground, conserving energy and heat. A cluster of insectoid Marn were spinning silk-like threads into makeshift tents. Every species relied on its natural physiology, and yet Aaron had none of those advantages. His survival depended on ingenuity alone. He crouched, scooped a handful of sand, and watched how quickly it slipped through his fingers. The top layer was burning, but the moment he dug deeper, it cooled dramatically. That meant there was a thermal gradient he could exploit. He marked the spot with a small metal rod and began to dig a narrow trench, just wide enough for his body. The deeper he went, the more tolerable it became, until at half a meter he could feel a faint difference, enough to sit without immediate pain. He lay down briefly, closing his eyes, letting his breathing slow. His body was still overheating, but at least the direct radiation had lessened. By midday, the horizon shimmered with mirages. The air trembled, creating illusions of lakes and moving shadows. A Vethra cadet nearby shouted in frustration. Her crystalline skin had begun to fracture, tiny cracks forming from the intense heat. The rest of her squad tried to assist, but their reflective surfaces scattered sunlight into each other, amplifying the burn instead of reducing it. Aaron watched silently from his trench. He had studied enough physics to understand what was happening. Total internal reflection, heating the very material meant to protect them. He shook his head and muttered under his breath. Perfect biology, wrong environment. Hours passed. The suns crawled across the sky like blazing predators. Some cadets collapsed, their armor overheating or biological systems failing. The instructors didn't intervene. The test allowed failure by heat exhaustion, but not death. Recovery drones would retrieve the unconscious before organs failed. Aaron paced himself, rationing every drop of hydration gel he had. He refused to drink all of it too early, knowing that dehydration wasn't immediate death. Panic was. As the afternoon waned, he climbed another dune to study the terrain. His visor map flickered from the interference, but he could still see dark bands of rock scattered miles away. Those stones might store heat differently than sand. If he could understand the way the ground absorbed and released energy, maybe he could use it later to create something more permanent than a trench. His mind worked not on survival in hours, but in systems, conduction, insulation, radiation. The others thought only of enduring. He was already thinking of how to use the heat instead of resisting it. When the suns dipped lower, the temperature still refused to drop. The air trembled with a dry wind that carried dust so fine it shimmered like powdered glass. Aaron sat on the edge of his trench, staring at the glowing horizon. His skin burned despite the protective layers, but his mind remained calm. He thought of Earth again, of the way humans had tamed fire not just to survive but to create. In every environment from ice to desert, humanity had found a way to turn disadvantage into advantage. That thought gave him quiet satisfaction. Far behind him, the instructor's platform hovered in the heat haze. Zarkun watched the humans' movements closely, recording data through his ocular implants. The insectoid commander had expected the human to last no more than 6 hours, but the readings told another story. Aaron's core temperature had stabilized. His vitals showed steady rhythm despite the external conditions. Zarkun's mandibles twitched with curiosity. He is not resisting the environment, he muttered to his assistant. He is learning from it. As night approached, the dunes slowly shifted from gold to deep red, then to black. The heat still radiated upward, trapped beneath the crust. The alien cadets began retreating to their pits, exhausted and disoriented. Some cried out for withdrawal. The instructors denied all requests. Only Aaron remained on the ridge, still awake, studying the sand's glow beneath the last light of the suns. He noticed how long the rocks held their warmth after sunset. The observation imprinted in his mind like a spark of inspiration. Heat could be stored. The idea began to form quietly, without words, just a feeling in his chest that perhaps this trial wasn't about surviving the heat at all. Perhaps it was about learning how to make it serve him. When the first stars emerged above Thraxis 9, Aaron dug deeper into his trench, using the cooled sand as a blanket. The desert fell silent except for the whisper of the wind. Around him, the alien cadets shivered, unprepared for how quickly the world turned cold after dark. He closed his eyes, not in despair, but in contemplation. Tomorrow, the real trial would begin. Not of endurance, but of transformation. Somewhere in the depths of his mind, an ancient human instinct stirred, the same that once guided the first tribes to build fire from nothing. On Thraxis 9, under the gaze of two dying suns, Aaron Cross was ready to remember what it meant to be human. The second dawn on Thraxis 9 arrived not with light, but with fire. The twin suns rose in unison, and the entire desert seemed to ignite in color and heat. The night chill vanished in minutes, replaced by waves of suffocating air that rolled across the dunes like invisible flames. Aaron opened his eyes to the burning horizon, his lashes coated with fine grains of sand. His trench had kept him alive through the cold hours, but now it trapped the heat like an oven. He crawled out, gasping, feeling the temperature climb with brutal speed. His body was drenched in sweat, his lips cracked and bleeding. His visor flickered, briefly showing 71 degrees Celsius before shutting down to prevent sensor melt. He removed it, squinting at the blinding sky. This was not survival anymore. It was endurance pushed beyond biology. The alien cadets who had made it through the night began to emerge from their shelters. Most moved slowly, their limbs heavy and unfocused. Some of the reptilian Vorn hissed weakly, their tongues lolling from dehydration. The crystalline Vethra were worse. Fissures had spread through their bodies overnight, thin lines of white-hot light that pulsed with every movement. A few of them had already succumbed, lying motionless with cracks that glittered like broken glass. The Zelka huddled together, whispering through their fluid-filled respirators, their translucent skin dull from evaporation. Every species here had evolved to survive heat, but none had evolved to endure this. Aaron studied them in silence. The wind blew hot against his face, carrying a fine spray of dust that felt like sparks on his skin. He turned toward the ridge he had climbed the day before. The rocks there seemed darker than the surrounding sand, denser, heavier, maybe capable of storing energy differently. He knew he needed to move before his strength faded. Every second under the sun drained his muscles, but standing still would kill him faster. He tightened the straps on his pack, checked the hydration tube, and began walking. The desert stretched endlessly, the dunes forming smooth, deceptive hills that promised shade but offered none. Each step sank half a foot into powder so dry it squeaked. The suns burned at different angles, and there was no shadow long enough to rest in. The air shimmered so violently that the horizon seemed to twist like a mirage. He walked for hours, his thoughts reduced to rhythm, step, breath, blink, endure. When the ridge finally came into view, he almost collapsed from relief. At the base of the rocks, the ground shifted in texture. The sand was finer, the color shifting from gold to a dull bronze. He knelt and pressed his palm against it. It was hot enough to sting, but not to burn. The heat here radiated upward in steady waves, unlike the unstable bursts across the open dunes. He brushed away the top layer and uncovered stones streaked with black mineral veins. They glowed faintly, absorbing sunlight like sponges. He realized the truth almost instantly. These rocks could hold heat for hours after sundown. That meant energy, stability, and maybe, if used properly, a way to control the environment instead of suffering beneath it. He gathered a few stones, each roughly the size of his hand, and arranged them in a small circle. The air wavered as he worked, but the act of building steadied his mind. He thought in mechanical steps, not in desperation. If the rocks could store heat, they could release it in a controlled way. If heat could be stored, it could also be directed. He didn't yet know what for, but the idea of purpose gave him strength. A loud crash echoed across the dunes. He turned and saw two Zelka cadets collapse together, their bodies slick with evaporated residue. Their internal fluids had boiled through their skin, leaving them shriveled and pale. One of them tried to rise, failed, and went still. The instructor's recovery drones descended silently, lifting the fallen without ceremony. Aaron watched the scene with grim detachment. It wasn't cruelty that filled the air now. It was silence. No one mocked the human anymore. The arrogance that had filled the first day had burned away like everything else. He returned to his task. Using a broken piece of his emergency shovel, he dug a shallow pit, large enough for his torso. Then he lined the bottom with the dark stones, layering them like bricks. He packed the gaps with compressed sand and sealed the surface with smaller fragments. The idea formed clearer in his mind. If he could create a pocket that absorbed heat during the day, it might release it slowly through the night, allowing him to rest without freezing. He didn't yet know it, but this simple thought, the notion of controlling temperature instead of fearing it, was the first step toward the invention that would shock the entire academy. By midday, the sun stood directly above, merciless and unmoving. The air was a weapon. The ground shimmered white, and the horizon blurred until it felt like walking inside a furnace. Aaron crouched near his pit, covering his head with a torn section of his gear. His eyes burned from the brightness. His hydration tube was nearly empty, and he calculated his rations in silence. He could last another 12 hours at most. He needed a plan that went beyond surviving until sundown. He needed a reason to make it through the next day. Suddenly, a cry pierced the wind. He turned and saw a Vorn cadet running blindly across the sand, his scales smoking. The alien screamed in a guttural language, clawing at his chest plate. His internal glands, the ones meant to regulate temperature, had overheated and burst. He fell forward and rolled down the dune. The smell of scorched organic matter filled the air. Aaron flinched but didn't move to help. The rules forbade direct assistance, and even if he broke them, the radiation exposure that close to the body could cripple him. He clenched his fists instead and whispered, "I won't end like that." The hours crawled. The suns began to descend, but the heat didn't fade. The rocks glowed softly now, the minerals radiating light like embers. He tested his pit again, pressing his palm to the sand above the stone layer, and smiled faintly when he felt the retained warmth. The concept worked. It wasn't enough to cook anything, not yet, but the principle was sound. He noted the gradient of heat, the way the top cooled faster than the base, and stored the data in his memory. The human mind, he thought, wasn't built for comfort. It was built for patterns. When the first sun dipped below the horizon, the other lingered like a cruel overseer, stretching the day into unbearable length. Aaron stayed awake, sitting beside the pit, watching as the air finally began to cool. Around him, the alien cadets were shadows now, sprawled across the sand, silent and unmoving. A few had dug holes too shallow to protect them. Others had buried themselves completely and suffocated. He stared at the field of motionless forms and wondered how many would remain by morning. The temperature dropped rapidly once both suns were gone. The air became crisp, and the heat drained from the dunes as if the planet exhaled. Aaron climbed into his pit, lying against the stone layer. The residual warmth felt like a living pulse beneath him. For the first time since arrival, he wasn't freezing. He closed his eyes, allowing exhaustion to take him. His body ached from dehydration, but his mind drifted into a strange calm. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was observing, learning, adapting. In his half-conscious state, he remembered his training back on the Orbital Academy. One of his instructors, a gruff old pilot named Harker, had told him, "The universe doesn't care about your biology, cadet. It only respects innovation. If your suit breaks, make a better one. If the environment kills you, change the environment." Those words returned to him now, echoing beneath the stars of Thraxis 9. Maybe that was the essence of being human. The refusal to obey the limits of nature, the instinct to shape the impossible into something useful. Far above, the instructors recorded data again. Zarkun noted the humans' stable heat signature and efficient energy regulation compared to the rest. "Interesting," he said softly to his aide. "He is not enduring the planet. He is shaping it to his needs." The insectoid commander didn't yet realize how literal those words would become. By dawn, the pit stones had cooled, but Aaron had slept through the night without hypothermia. The others were not so fortunate. He awoke to the sound of retrieval drones carrying away another dozen cadets. The desert was littered with the silver markers that denoted failure. Only a handful remained. He stood slowly, his joints stiff, his throat raw, but his mind sharp. The heat would return soon, but this time he was ready. The stones had worked better than he imagined, and as he looked toward the rising suns, an idea stronger than fatigue began to form. The desert wasn't an enemy. It was a tool waiting to be understood. Somewhere in this hellscape of sand and fire, he would find a way to use the heat itself as a resource. What began as survival would become creation, and when that moment came, Thraxis 9 would remember the name of the human who dared to turn its fury into warmth. By the third day, the desert had claimed its reputation as a silent executioner. The twin suns of Thraxis 9 glared from opposite ends of the sky, turning the dunes into molten gold. Heat rose from every surface, pressing against the lungs like invisible hands. The number of cadets had dwindled to less than a dozen. Aaron stood alone on the ridge he had reached the day before, his lips cracked, his skin scorched beneath the collar of his uniform. His pit of stones had kept him alive through another freezing night, but now his body demanded more than endurance. His hydration supply was almost gone, his rations reduced to powder that felt like ash in his mouth. He needed a breakthrough. The thought of surviving one more night like this without food or water filled him with quiet urgency. He crouched near the cluster of dark rocks he had collected earlier and ran his fingertips across their rough surface. The minerals were hotter than the surrounding sand. When he lifted one and held it close to his face, he saw faint ripples of distortion rising from it, like the mirage effect of distant heat. That meant the rock wasn't just absorbing sunlight, it was retaining energy far longer than expected. He felt a flicker of inspiration. If he could trap that heat and control its release, he might be able to turn it into something usable. Something ancient in him stirred, a memory of stories about how humanity once tamed the deserts of Earth with nothing but sand, wind, and ingenuity. The idea came to him slowly, not as a plan, but as a feeling. He looked at the sand stretching endlessly around him and thought of the primitive ovens used by early civilizations, simple pits layered with clay and heated stones. Those ovens had baked food, forged tools, even purified water. The environment that killed could also sustain, if one understood it well enough. He took a long breath, his mind clearing. He would build an oven, not for warmth this time, but for transformation. The first step was gathering materials. He began walking along the ridge, his boots sinking with every step. The desert was quiet, except for the constant hiss of wind scraping over sand. He found more of the black-veined stones embedded in the base of the dune and pried them loose with a shard of metal from his broken shovel. Each piece radiated warmth that seared through his gloves. By the time he had gathered a small pile, his arms ached and his vision swam from dehydration. He paused to steady himself, staring out at the vast, blazing emptiness. There was no sign of the other cadets. The only movement came from the distant shimmer of the Academy drones circling high above, recording every action for later analysis. Back at his ridge, he began digging. The sand shifted like liquid beneath his hands, and each motion sent tiny avalanches sliding back into the pit. He worked methodically, shaping a hollow that curved inward at the sides. His mind drifted into a rhythm: scoop, press, compact, breathe. Sweat poured down his face, and each drop evaporated before reaching his chin. He ignored the pain. What mattered was precision. He needed the shape to reflect heat inward, to trap it the way a dome trapped air. The concept was simple physics, containment and reflection. Once the pit was complete, he layered the bottom with the black stones and packed the gaps with dense sand. He remembered the way glassmakers on Earth had once used desert sand to create translucent materials. The thought made him smile weakly. If he survived this, he would have more than just a survival story. He would have proof that even in alien conditions, the human instinct to create could not be extinguished. The next challenge was igniting the heat. Direct sunlight alone wasn't enough. He needed to focus it. He rummaged through his pack, searching for anything reflective. His visor had shattered earlier, but one half of the lens still held a faint mirror-like quality. He angled it toward the sun's, focusing the beams into a tight circle on one of the rocks. The air above it began to ripple. He waited, holding the angle steady. After several minutes, a thin wisp of smoke rose from the mineral surface, followed by a faint hiss as the trapped air beneath the sand expanded. He backed away slightly, shielding his face. When he lifted the lens again, the stone glowed red at its core. The pit began to radiate warmth, spreading evenly through the base. It worked. Aaron exhaled shakily, staring into the glowing cavity. He had just created a heat chamber out of sand and sunlight. The thought alone would have made most instructors laugh, yet here it was, a working oven in the middle of a lifeless planet. He wasn't entirely sure why he was doing this beyond survival, but instinct told him that transformation was the key to endurance. If he could make food, he could make energy. If he could make energy, he could live. He reached into his pack again and took out the remnants of his nutrient powder. It was meant to be dissolved in water, but there was none left. The fine dust clung to his fingers, useless on its own. He mixed it with a handful of crushed sand and fibers from the inner lining of his uniform, which he had torn apart earlier for insulation. The mixture felt rough, but it bound together under pressure, forming a crude, dough-like paste. It was absurd. He knew that. Yet something in him refused to abandon the idea. He shaped the mixture into a small lump and placed it carefully into the glowing pit, covering it with a thin layer of sand to prevent direct contact with the flames. Then he waited. Minutes turned into an hour. The smell that eventually drifted from the pit was faint, but unmistakable. Warm, earthy, slightly sweet. Aaron leaned closer, his heart pounding. When he brushed the sand aside, he saw the lump had hardened, turning a dull brown. He broke it open, and steam escaped. Against all logic, he had baked something. The texture was uneven, the taste nearly bitter, but it was food. It was life created out of heat and dust. He laughed softly, a sound half delirium and half triumph. The desert echoed it back, hollow but proud. For the first time since the trial began, he felt stronger than the planet itself. He wasn't surviving anymore. He was reclaiming control. The act of creation fed him more than the strange bread itself. He sat beside the oven, chewing slowly, feeling energy seep back into his muscles. Far above, the observation drones shifted course, focusing their lenses on the human's position. Zarkun, watching from the control deck, narrowed his multifaceted eyes. "What is he doing?" he asked one of the aides. The assistant hesitated, replaying the footage. "He appears to be cooking, Commander." Zarkun's mandibles clicked sharply. "Cooking? On Thraxis 9? The absurdity made even his alien physiology twitch with disbelief. "Record this sequence. No one else is to interfere." Back in the desert, Aaron leaned back against the ridge, staring at the two suns. His body ached, his hands were raw, and his lips were split open, but his spirit burned stronger than ever. The oven still glowed softly beside him, releasing waves of trapped heat. He realized he could use it not only for food, but for survival through the coming night. The stones inside retained warmth far longer than any shelter could provide. With enough refinement, he could build multiple chambers, one for storage, one for resting, and one for cooking. The possibilities spiraled in his mind like sparks from a flame. As dusk approached, the horizon bled red and gold, and the desert began to hum with the changing temperature. He watched the alien cadets in the distance, fewer than before, their silhouettes staggering across the dunes. Some looked toward him, drawn by the faint column of heat rising from his ridge. He didn't call out or wave. This was his experiment, his test of will and invention. If any came close, perhaps he would share what he had made. But for now, he simply watched the suns sink below the dunes, his creation casting a dull glow against the encroaching night. When darkness fell, Aaron fed a few more rocks into the oven, sealing it with compacted sand. The warmth it released was steady and comforting. He lay beside it, feeling the radiant heat soak into his bones. Above him, the sky of Thraxis 9 burned with distant stars, cold and indifferent. Yet for the first time in days, he didn't feel like a speck under an uncaring cosmos. He felt connected to the planet, to the trial, to every ancestor who had ever turned adversity into invention. He closed his eyes with the faintest smile on his lips. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, under twin moons and endless silence, he rested beside the proof that even in the harshest corner of the galaxy, a human could still build fire from dust and hope from heat. The fourth dawn came cloaked in heat so severe that the air itself seemed to hum with tension. The dunes shimmered, shifting under the merciless suns like liquid glass. Aaron awoke to the sound of faint footsteps crunching through the sand. When he turned his head, he saw 2 surviving cadets moving toward his ridge, one of the crystalline Vethra, her skin dull and fractured, and a reptilian Vorn whose scales had begun to peel from dehydration. They moved slowly, their movements desperate and uncertain, drawn toward the faint column of warm air rising from his sand oven. Aaron watched in silence as they approached, their bodies trembling from exhaustion. He didn't speak until the Vorn collapsed a few meters away, his clawed hands sinking into the sand. "Stay still," Aaron said hoarsely, his voice barely more than a whisper. The heat had shredded his throat. He reached for his hydration tube, hesitated, then tossed it toward the alien. The Vorn lifted his head weakly, staring at the offering as if unsure it was real. "Small sips," Aaron murmured. "You'll vomit if you drink too fast." The alien obeyed without question. The Vethra remained standing for a few seconds longer before her legs gave out and she sat heavily, the fractures in her crystalline body glowing faintly from within. The sight was both beautiful and tragic, like glass about to shatter under invisible pressure. Aaron crouched beside his sand oven. The structure had cooled overnight, but the stones inside still radiated a comforting warmth. He brushed away the top layer of sand and removed a few of the darker rocks, placing them on the open ground to absorb the rising heat. The air shimmered as the suns climbed higher, and the desert returned to its infernal rhythm. His skin prickled, but his mind remained steady. He had already proven that the desert could be manipulated. Now he intended to expand his experiment. He tore open one of his ration packets, mixing the remaining powder with fine sand and a few drops of water from his reserve. The mixture thickened quickly, forming a rough dough. The Vorn watched him with confusion. "What? What are you doing?" the alien rasped, his voice cracking through dried vocal membranes. "You're wasting your strength." Aaron smiled faintly without looking up. "Making breakfast." The Vethra tilted her head, the faint light inside her fractures pulsing weakly. "You cook in the middle of this death field?" she asked. Her voice was melodic even in pain, each word resonating like a crystal tone. Aaron didn't answer. He had no intention of explaining what he already knew. Most wouldn't understand until they saw it. He shaped the dough into small, flat discs and placed them inside the sand oven, sealing it carefully. The air above shimmered with trapped heat. Minutes passed. The smell began to drift again, faint but distinct, a warm and earthy aroma that didn't belong on a planet like this. The Vorn sniffed the air, his golden eyes widening slightly. "That smell," he whispered. "It reminds me of home." The Vethra, who had been staring blankly at the horizon, turned toward the pit. For a moment, she forgot the pain fracturing her body. "It smells alive," she said softly. Aaron lifted the sand cover, revealing the golden-brown discs. They were uneven, some burnt at the edges, others still pale, but the smell was irresistible. He handed one to each of the cadets. "Eat slowly," he said. "Your bodies need solid food." The Vorn hesitated, staring at the bread as if it were sacred. When he finally took a bite, a visible tremor passed through his entire frame. His eyes closed, and a low sound escaped his throat. Not speech, but a primal expression of relief. The Vethra followed, biting delicately into the disc. Her inner fractures flickered brighter, pulsing with renewed energy. Aaron ate last, savoring each mouthful. The taste was strange but deeply satisfying, something that transcended hunger. It was warmth, memory, and victory wrapped together. For a few minutes, the three of them sat in silence, united by something older than any species present, the act of sharing food. Far above on the observation platform, Zarkun and the other instructors watched in disbelief. "He has created sustenance," one of the aides said. Zarkun's mandibles clicked. "Not sustenance," he corrected. "Culture. Look at them. They are not just surviving anymore. They are living." On the ground, the air grew heavier. The suns reached their zenith, and the dunes began to radiate blistering waves. The Vorn groaned, shielding his face with his claws. Aaron stood and scanned the horizon. He noticed that the sand closer to his oven appeared darker and less reflective. The heat had fused its upper layer into a thin crust, primitive glass. That gave him another idea. He crouched and broke a piece of the hardened surface, examining its smooth underside. The reflection of sunlight against it was dazzling. He realized that if he could shape enough of these glass-like panels, he could control light itself, redirect it, intensify it, or block it. The desert had given him tools. All he needed was patience. He began gathering more stones, placing them in a ring to create additional ovens. His hands moved automatically, each motion guided by instinct and calculation. The Vorn tried to help, but collapsed again after a few minutes. Aaron didn't stop him. There was no point in pushing another's limits when he could carry the rhythm alone. By late afternoon, he had constructed 3 smaller ovens beside the original one. The air shimmered with concentrated heat, and faint trails of smoke rose from the ground. The surface beneath his feet had changed texture entirely. It was no longer sand, but something closer to baked clay. He could feel stability forming beneath the chaos. When he looked at it, he thought of home again, of how humans had built civilizations from dust. It wasn't so different here. The Vethra's voice broke his concentration. "You are different from us," she said softly. "You take the same pain we do and turn it into something new." Aaron didn't respond right away. He pressed a rock deeper into the sand, adjusting the angle to catch more sunlight. "Maybe it's not pain," he said finally. "Maybe it's just opportunity that hurts until you understand it." She tilted her fractured head, the faint glow from within her eyes reflecting the heat. "Your species must come from madness," she murmured. He smiled faintly. "Some call it creativity." As the suns began to sink, the light stretched across the dunes like fire flowing through glass. The horizon burned red, and the shadows lengthened. The 3 of them sat around the ovens, eating what little remained of the baked discs. The air had cooled slightly, enough to breathe without pain. The Vorn leaned back, staring up at the first star piercing the sky. "I thought this trial was meant to destroy us," he said quietly. "Maybe it was meant to remind us." Aaron glanced at him. Remind you of what? That life doesn't belong to comfort, the Vorn said. It belongs to those who learn to shape it. Aaron nodded, the faintest smile crossing his face. That's a good way to put it. He reached out and stirred the sand near one of the ovens, watching the faint glow of trapped heat. The warmth would last through the night again. He didn't know how many of the other cadets had survived, but he was certain of one thing. The lesson of Thraxis 9 was no longer about survival. It was about invention. As darkness deepened, the Vethra leaned closer to the glowing pit. "Your oven," she said. "It holds light even after the suns die." Aaron looked at the faint red radiance that pulsed through the cracks between the stones. "It's not light," he said softly. "It's memory." The Vethra didn't understand the word, but she nodded as if she did. The night wind rose, carrying a faint trace of the bread's scent across the dunes. For a moment, it felt as if the entire desert paused to breathe with them. Above, the instructors watched in silence. Zarkun's voice was barely audible when he spoke. "If this is what humanity does when stripped of all tools," he said, "then I begin to understand why their worlds never die easily." Below, the human, the Vorn, and the Vethra sat beside their ovens, 3 survivors who had turned a furnace into a hearth. The dunes no longer seemed endless or empty. In their glow, the desert of Thraxis 9 had, for the first time, become something almost human. The final day began in silence, the kind that arrives before a storm. The suns had not yet risen, but the horizon already glowed faintly, promising another wave of merciless heat. Aaron opened his eyes to the low hum of the wind moving through the dunes. His makeshift ovens still pulsed with faint warmth, the stones beneath the sand glowing like buried embers. The Vorn slept close to one of the pits, his chest rising and falling slowly, while the Vethra sat awake, her fractured crystalline skin catching the faintest light of dawn. She had not spoken much during the night, but Aaron could see her gaze fixed on the horizon. It was the same look he had seen in soldiers before battle, a mix of fear and surrender, as if she knew something was about to end. When the first sun breached the line of dunes, the heat surged instantly, as though the desert exhaled fire. Aaron rose and stretched, his muscles aching from days of dehydration and strain. His body was thinner, his movements slower, but his eyes were sharp and focused. He looked down at the ovens, their surfaces hardened into a mosaic of fused glass and stone. Each layer he had built now formed a pattern, a spiral, almost natural in its symmetry. He ran his hand over it, and it reminded him of ancient human ruins buried in sand back on Earth, monuments left behind by those who refused to be erased. The Vorn stirred and groaned softly, lifting his scaled head. His throat rasped as he spoke. "Is it the last day?" Aaron nodded. "By tonight the retrieval ships come. If we're alive, that means we pass." The Vorn gave a low, dry laugh. "If," he repeated. His eyes shifted toward the glowing stones. "You changed the trial, human. This place feels different now." Aaron crouched near one of the ovens and began adjusting the upper layer, creating a small opening. "The place didn't change," he said. "We did." He placed several more black-veined stones inside, using the lens fragment to focus the sunlight as he had done before. The heat concentrated quickly, and the air above shimmered in bright ripples. He worked silently, his mind already focused on a new thought. The ovens could do more than sustain them. They could serve as a signal. If he arranged them in a particular pattern, the heat signatures might reach the orbiting Academy drones. He could use the very desert to announce their survival. The Vethra tilted her head slightly. "You're building again," she said quietly, her voice brittle. "Even now, when it's almost over." Aaron smiled faintly without looking up. "That's what humans do," he replied. "When something ends, we build something new to remember it." As the suns climbed higher, the temperature soared beyond endurance. The sand shimmered in waves, and the horizon blurred until it looked like the world itself was melting. The Vorn began to struggle again, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His species was built for heat, but not for days of exposure without nourishment. The Vethra's body radiated light through her fractures, a sign that her internal structure was reaching the limit of endurance. Aaron moved between them both, adjusting shades of fabric, rationing the last of the hydration gel. Every drop was a calculation, every gesture a choice between compassion and logic. He chose compassion. By midday, the ovens blazed like miniature suns. Aaron stood back, shielding his eyes. The circle he had formed reflected light in a spiral pattern, visible even from the dunes above. It was beautiful in a strange, haunting way, a monument of heat and survival. He knew the drones would see it. The desert, once nothing but a trial ground, now bore the mark of thought, of invention. The idea filled him with quiet satisfaction. He sat down beside the Vorn and watched the light flicker across the sand. The alien turned his head weakly. "Why bread?" he asked. "You could have eaten your rations. You could have done anything. Why that?" Aaron's gaze drifted over the dunes. "Because it's the first thing we ever made together," he said softly. On Earth, fire and bread meant civilization. They reminded us we were more than animals. Maybe I just wanted to remind myself of that. The Vorn blinked slowly. "Strange creature," he murmured. "You turned suffering into meaning." Aaron smiled faintly. "It's the only way we've ever survived." As the suns began their slow descent, the light changed from blinding white to molten orange. The heat softened, and the wind shifted direction, carrying a low, rumbling vibration. It was the sound of engines, distant but approaching. The retrieval ships were coming. Aaron felt relief ripple through him, but it was tempered by a deep, unshakable melancholy. He looked around at the ovens, the broken tools, and the shapes carved into the sand. This place had nearly killed him, yet it had also become something sacred. He didn't want to leave it behind like another battlefield turned to dust. The Vethra rose unsteadily, her body glimmering in the fading light. "The ships will come soon," she said. Her voice was faint but calm. "Do you think they will understand what you've done here?" Aaron shook his head. "Probably not. They'll see the readings, the structures, the survival metrics, but they won't understand what it felt like to sit here and turn fire into food." She stepped closer, her translucent face catching the last reflection of the sun's. "Then it is good we were here to see it," she said. When the retrieval ships finally appeared, they came as streaks of silver against the dying sky. The dunes trembled as the vessels descended, stirring up whirlwinds of dust. The ovens cracked under the pressure of the downdraft, their delicate glass shells fracturing but not collapsing. Aaron shielded his eyes as the hatch opened and the recovery officers emerged in reflective suits. One of them shouted through a translator module, "Cadet Aaron Cross, step forward!" He didn't move immediately. He looked once more at the small circle of ovens, their faint glow still visible beneath the sand. The Vorn and the Vethra stood beside him, both too weak to walk without support. He placed a hand on each of their shoulders, steadying them. Then he spoke quietly, more to himself than to them. "No one will ever see this place the way we did. But it doesn't matter. It's real, because we made it real." He led them toward the ship, each step slow and deliberate. The metal ramp beneath his boots felt alien after so many days on living sand. Inside the vessel, cool air washed over his skin, and for the first time in days, he could breathe deeply. The medics rushed forward, checking vitals, scanning for tissue damage, but Aaron ignored them. He turned back toward the open hatch. Through the swirling dust, he could see the ridge, the faint outlines of his ovens glowing like constellations on the ground. From the command deck of the observation platform, Zarkun watched the feed one last time. His voice was quiet, almost reverent. "Mark this trial as completed," he ordered, "and archive all data under Human Innovation Protocol." His aide hesitated. "What should the summary state, Commander?" Zarkun's mandibles flexed in contemplation. "Write this. Human cadet redefined survival parameters through creation of self-sustaining thermal structures. Demonstrated behavioral anomaly, turning a hostile environment into a habitat." The platform fell silent. Below, the ships rose into the sky, carrying the survivors away. The dunes shifted in their wake, swallowing footprints, cooling the remnants of glass and stone. The wind whispered across the surface, erasing all signs of struggle, but not the memory of what had been built. Inside the recovery ship, Aaron sat by the viewport, watching Thraxis 9 recede into a sphere of gold and red. The Vorn slept beside him, and the Vethra stared quietly out the opposite window, her fractures now dim but still intact. The hum of the ship's engines filled the silence. Aaron reached into his pocket and pulled out a small shard of fused glass, a fragment he had taken from the first oven before boarding. He turned it between his fingers, the faint light inside catching his reflection. It was warm even now, holding the memory of the desert's heat. He closed his hand around it, leaned back, and let out a long breath. The trial had tested endurance, but what it truly measured was imagination. Thraxis 9 had not defeated him. It had taught him something far more valuable, that survival without creation was just existence, and creation was the highest form of defiance. As the ship drifted into orbit, the suns of Thraxis 9 burned behind it like twin torches, casting light across the void. Aaron watched them until the planet disappeared from view, his mind silent but his spirit alive. The ovens, the bread, the warmth, all of it would fade into legend, perhaps misunderstood, perhaps forgotten. But deep within him, he knew the truth. Humanity's strength was not in resisting nature, but in reshaping it. Even in the heart of an alien furnace, a human could still find a way to bake light into bread.